Okay. Hi there, everybody. We've got about 1 hour and 25 minutes all together to go through the topic. Uh, as Elena said, this is a webinar about making decisions, particularly using visual methods to do so. I'd like to make a few thank yous to begin with. Thank you to Elena for inviting me. Thank you also to Maria, who's also been helping me to get ready for this session and upload everything. No, the issues were with me, Svetlana, so hopefully everything should be okay now. Also, thank you to all of you. As Elena said, thank you for giving up a bit of your weekend to be here. It's great to see many dedicated teachers interested in working on their professional development. So let's get started. But before we do, I'd just like to make one caveat, one kind of disclaimer. Nothing in this presentation is magic bullet. It's not really anything, I think, revolutionary. It's not the intention. But I hope that by the end of this session, you'll have a few practical ideas that you can take away with you for your next classes, whether that's immediately sort of on Monday or the next few months, or maybe even the next academic year. So I obviously know Elena from various conferences. I think there are some familiar names, although I'm not 100% sure. But I always never assume that people know who I am. So just a quick introduction about the ways in which I'm involved in ELT. And so my students will know me from the classroom. So I'm a teacher, primarily have taught ESOL in the UK. So that's largely for people who have moved to the UK to live, to work. They've had to leave their countries for whatever reason. Also, more recently, I've been involved in materials writing. I've been fortunate to be involved in part of a workbook for a course book series. I've also written a few activities for online use for various different places and different people, different organisations. But perhaps the kind of the main way I'm involved in ELT is as a volunteer for IATEFL, so the International Association. I'm currently on the committee for the teacher development special interest group within IATEFL, for whom I work on the website. And so that is me in a nutshell. I'm not seeing any chat, so I still hope that you can still hear okay. If there are any issues as we go on, please put comments, questions in that chat box. I'll try and keep up with it. However, I will make sure to have a bit of time at the end so that you can ask any questions that you have as we go through. Okay, so decision-making models. Are you familiar with decision-making models or visual organizers? Can you just indicate in the chat box whether yes or no? Have you heard this term before? Don't give away any names at the moment. We're going to go through a few models. Not really, okay? Okay, well, my next slide will hopefully actually reveal that maybe you have. Sorry about the formatting there. That just says decision-making models, question mark. And it's just a quick flowchart. So have you used them before? Some people not sure. Maybe yes, maybe no, not really. If you have, in the chat box, please stay tuned. I hope you'll pick up some tips in this session. But if not, have you completed a training course, whether that's sort of the well-known sort of CELTA or Trinity Cert type things, maybe even Delta higher level, or master's programs, or other teaching degrees in your country? So yes or no? I think it's maybe for most people. No? Okay. I'm also including in sort of the Russian system as well, the system wherever you're based. Okay, well, even if yes, please stay tuned because I hope you'll pick up some tips. But no, have you ever used a course book in your teaching? Yes or no? For better or worse reasons? Right, okay, so whether you have or you haven't, please stay tuned because we'll go through a few models and sort of show how they fit in with the ELT world, how I think they can be useful for us. I don't know if you noticed, but the first two slides there, this one and the previous one, this is one type of model already for you today. Have you come across this type of chart before with the boxes and arrows? So it's like a particular type of model we refer to as, I mentioned before, flow charts. So this is one for free. This is not one of the models we'll be looking at in the session, but this model of flowing through answering questions. You usually have a binary option, perhaps sometimes three, yes or no, and it helps you get to some kind of outcome. There are quite some humorous ones online that you can find. But these aren't just, they don't come from nowhere. If you look through any kind of course book, for example, like the Cutting Edge series, you may have come across these activities, I suppose, on the pages. So we have a vocabulary focused one, this word spot, on the left of the screen as you look at it, and we have this practice on the right hand side. So similarly, we've got two other models. Well, one is actually the same, really. First of all, on the left, a kind of a map, concept map, maybe mind map, terms that we use for this kind of spider diagram out from one node in the middle. And on the right hand side, this doesn't actually look like it, but it's sort of like a flow chart. You've got the different options that people have to say in order to get to that final conversation. The quite scaffolded version of conversation, which is kind of where we start with. I think this is from maybe an intermediate or lower level edition of that book, Cutting Edge. So I haven't got a summary slide, but I'd just like to outline what we're going to look at now in the session. First of all, I'm going to go through the definition and inspiration for myself to start kind of using these in my own teaching and my own professional life in ELT. We will then work through three models. I don't want to do any more than that because of time. I want to give you enough time to engage with each one. We'll look briefly at the tools you might use to make these if you want to have them on a computer or a smart device or pen or paper. I will have some homework tasks for you at the end, some things for you to follow up on. And finally, we'll have the references at the end. And as I said, some time for questions. So if you do have any big questions, save them to the end, but I'll try and address things as they come up if you put them in the chat box. So definitions, and so just to be clear that we're not kind of looking at anything very, very huge revolutionary. It was quite simple. So when I talk about these decision-making models, sometimes I use the term visual organizers. You might have heard of the term graphic organizers, maybe even advanced organizers, depending on whether you've come across these before online or in any literature. For me, they're all kind of similar. They're all frames for organizing information in some way. And these 4 points are quite key. So they're designed to simplify. They're not going to show absolutely everything related to a decision. They're going to boil it down to kind of the real core ingredients or elements that make up that process. They're going to sum up. They're not going to be definitive. They're going to help us come to some kind of conclusion. They are visuals, so just don't want to scare people. That doesn't mean you need to be artistic. Pretty much lines and boxes and arrows, maybe little stick men sometimes, but that's about as artistic as it gets. I've gotten used to kind of drawing, you know, when you get used to putting little items up on the board to do some simple vocabulary, but it's nothing more involved than the simple line drawing, really. So don't be afraid if you're not that artistic. Finally, these are methods, and that's really key as well. They're not, as I said, revolutionary, and they're only going to be as good as the person who's using them or the people who are using them. And you'll see at the bottom a reference. These are the two authors, and this is the inspiration behind the whole thing. This is the main kind of core resource that I've drawn from and used in my own practice, and it is this book, The Decision Book by, apologies for my pronunciation of sort of Germanic names, I think Mikhail Krugerus and Roman Schepeler. And this was a chance kind of purchase. It's actually an updated version, so this is not the original book I bought. When I was traveling to an English language teaching conference, I saw this book and I picked it up and just found it really, really interesting. It's also quite informal. If you get a copy of this yourselves, you'll find that there's some elements of almost humor throughout, sort of funny little things. But it's a series of models. So for further research, this is a good one. There's an associated website, I believe, if you Google. I'm not sure of the URL myself, but you know, that's something that you can follow up on when I give that homework task at the end. Now, I don't know if you've looked ahead. I hope not, because that will give the game away. We're going to look at the first model, which is going to be SWOT analysis. Now, if you're in business English teaching, or perhaps EAP or ESP, you may have come across this. Don't give away what the words or the letters are standing for yet. We'll go through them in a moment. I'll just ask you. So this is from, oh gosh, where was it? The study of various businesses. Out of Stanford University, they did kind of meta-analysis. And I will just ask you now what you think these different letters stand for. So the S, you can add in the chat box what you think that might be, if you haven't skipped ahead at all. And I'm guessing that this is probably familiar with some people. Familiar for some people. perhaps the W, which is the opposite of the S. I can see one person typing in my chat box here. I'm not sure if that's any issues with my my webinar platform here, but maybe if you're thinking about it, I can't get feedback from you at the moment. And the O and the T, I'll go on to the next slide to confirm what those are. So you'll see that we're talking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats involved within the moment of us taking a decision or taking some kind of action. So on the left-hand side, that's focused on us. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? And on the right-hand side, it's more to do with the situation. So what opportunities does this particular decision present us with? What are the threats to us? Maybe not life-threatening, but what might make it go badly? And I'm going to go through a few examples with you, my own examples that I've done sort of fairly quickly relating to kind of ELT stuff. So clicking onto the next slide, you'll see this is my SWOT analysis for preparing to give this webinar as an example. It's not the first webinar. You'll see that that's one of my strengths, is my experience of being on a webinar platform. You already have seen that at the beginning, if you were here, the technology might not work as expected. So that was a threat to this going well or not so well. And I'm not going to read all those out, but that show you that I've thought about this situation. I've thought about my strengths. So what am I good at, or what experience do I have? What weaknesses I have as well. So although I am relatively experienced as a speaker or webinar platforms or face-to-face events, I haven't done a workshop since, let's say, March. I haven't used Click Meeting before, which is this webinar platform. So again, that's another weakness. It's not to say that these are things that are necessarily blocking, but they're just things that I've recognized in myself relating to this particular event, this moment. Oh, I see now that there was the answer in the chat box came in at the bottom. I have to scroll down. So good. I see strength, weakness, and opportunities, threats. Came up with that before. And then opportunities and threats for this situation. Now, next, this is from last summer. I was teaching an EAP course, and we had this task for our students, which was one of their assessments. They had to deliver a presentation, and one key thing was that they had to analyze the proposal, their proposed idea, using this method of SWOT analysis. They could use it quite simply like that. You could just be in the class getting your students to plan. I could even be planning a party or planning a trip. And they would think about those strengths and weaknesses. There'll be a few more examples I'd like you to look at in a moment, and some work for you to do. This is a webinar workshop, so hopefully you'll get involved with that. But next, I just want to highlight that although these would be before the event, there's no harm in also doing an analysis like this after. I hope that's clear enough for everybody to see, because the writings actually come out quite small. But this was thinking back to my first presentation that I gave, which was actually at a conference in Turkey, quite a few years ago now. And you'll see that some of the strengths are kind of similar. So speaking in front of people as a teacher, that's something you do every day. Weaknesses, lack of experience in some ways. Threats, so knowledge of the language was one there. but also the opportunities, which are the kind of, I suppose, most important things to be thinking about here. The opportunity to share with an audience, to meet people, whether that's in person or whether that's electronically like this, and share what you do. Are we all happy so far? Anything you need to ask at the moment? Because the next is going to be some work for you, which I'd like you to try out. Good afternoon. Is that Irina? I think my reading is really bad. Okay, I'll go to the next slide to give you some ideas now. And this is where, hopefully, if you are online, if you're on Twitter, for example, there's an opportunity for us to share here. Here are a few examples of times when you might find it useful to complete a quick SWOT analysis. So, for example, starting a course, as I said before, planning a class trip, perhaps attending a conference, workshop, or webinar, maybe even delivering one yourself if you get involved in these kind of events that way. But maybe even as mundane as a particular classroom activity. So what I'd like to do now is to allow a few minutes. If you have got pen and paper, or if you've got some kind of electronic device you can draw on, to draw that quadrant. So 4 equal spaces for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And if you are on Twitter, this hashtag TrendyMH18 is a way that they can be collated there. It's unique. There's nothing before. I've tweeted on it once if you're on Twitter and you search for it. So I'd like to give a moment now for you to do that, and then we'll move on to look at some more models for various different purposes. So just allow 2-3 minutes before I move on here, but you can be working on that at the side. I'm conscious of the time that we've got just under an hour allotted left, so I'd like to get through those 3 models. And also, if there are any questions that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat box at the moment, and I'll address them in these couple of minutes. Okay, I can't see any activity, so I'm not sure if you are getting on with that, but what I'll do is I'll move on to the next model. I'm hoping I'll be able to explain this. This has come up slightly differently on the screen than in my original PowerPoint. So this next one is called the superficial knowledge matrix. And another disclaimer here that the knowledge that is in this is in fact, it's come from the authors of this book. So particular items that they've chosen may not be the same as what you would think of as superficial knowledge, as it were. Some of them might be a bit risque, perhaps, and you may have completely different ideas, and that's completely fine. Yeah, this disclaimer is that not everything in these models will be appropriate for all audiences. So use your professional judgment. You know your students. You know what will work in a class with those students. You know what won't work. So just to bear that in mind. And I see that my animation on my slide has disappeared from the next one. So I just need to think for a moment how I'm going to go through this with you. Right. I'm going to make a quick judgment here. I'm going to close my presentation and I'm going to try and share my screen with you so that you can see this as it pops up. So bear with me for a moment. Okay, thank you very much for that comment. Not much activity, what to do. Okay, I'll jump back a moment actually before we go on to this one because I want to sort of be clear that you know what to do. So I'll just go back to this one. It's quite clear. So we have one of those situations. So for example, let's think of the one about teaching the past perfect. Is it past perfect or is it future perfect? Future perfect passive, right? Okay, so as an English language teacher with some experience, what might be your strength in preparing for that situation? Teaching the future perfect passive. What strength do you have as a teacher? What do you know to do? Maybe what have you done before? So we know what it is, we know how to teach it. So your experience, you've done it before perhaps, you've studied grammar, and you know the form, you know how to make it. Okay, that's a definite strength. If you're a teacher with maybe just a few months experience, perhaps maybe that's not something you would necessarily have, but you might have read about it. So about a weakness, what could be a weakness? Think of yourself, but also think maybe of a teacher that might be in a different position. I will go to the next model in a moment. So just to think of an example, a weakness might be that it might be difficult to represent certain parts of that visually. If you want to write it up on the board, how are you going to convey that passive structure with relation to the particular tense? Okay, an opportunity might not be fun, but the opportunity is that your students learn the structure or get more familiar with the structure. Maybe a threat could be you turn up to the classroom and the whiteboard has fallen off the wall. Something like that. Okay, I hope that sort of thinking through has helped to understand SWOT analysis. I will go to the next model, and I'm going to upload a different version, so bear with me for just a few minutes because the animation has not come through with the PowerPoint, so I'll just be a few moments to share that with you. Yes, okay, right, here we are. I've got my PDF now, so this should look better. It should be better. So going to go on to the next one. As I said before, this is a kind of more content-based model. It's something that already has things plotted on it. And basically here I will show it to you. Again, I hope that's clear enough. It's quite small on my screen. I hope you're able to read at least some of that. And you will see that this model also has 4 different areas. And we've got different items plotted against 2 different clines, 2 different scales. So on the one hand, we've got at the bottom things that are supposedly difficult. Again, I'm saying this is according to the authors of the book. They have come up with this scale, as it were. And then at the top, the items that I think are more easy. And then to the left of the screen, items which might be considered embarrassing to know, these trivial items of knowledge. And then to the right, things that are more impressive. So on the one hand, we have the steps of the waltz, which they consider quite easy. I'm flat-footed. Dancing is not really my thing, so I would put that more difficult and fairly impressive. You can impress people with dancing ability. Going to the other end of the scale, knowing the names of IKEA products, so your Benno table or bookcase. More embarrassing, but also more difficult, in their opinion. A few items here you'll see slightly questionable. You wouldn't use these with all your students. And an example from when I gave a webinar on this topic before, and just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting you use all of these, because you'll come up with things like this. This was a tweet from another attendee, and he was commenting about somebody else in the webinar chat, saying that they were saying that that's not appropriate for their context. Of course not. That wasn't what I was suggesting. So further on to explain, again, that's quite small, so I'll just talk briefly through, showing the 4 quadrants, and one had one with Paris Hilton's lovers, brass eyes, and so on. And I'm not suggesting you use these at all, okay? I'm suggesting that this is a way of presenting items of information, and we'll see an ELT spin on that in a moment. But as it is, here's a discussion activity for you, something I hope will go a bit more smoothly than our SWOT analysis. So the next slide is, do you agree? Are these embarrassing items? Are they more impressive? Which ones would you move in the chat box? If you could just type a few of your thoughts, ideas about it. Which ones would you use as if you were presenting this to your classes? Which ones wouldn't you choose? And in a moment, we'll look about plotting something else. So if you can add in the chat box your thoughts on this matrix as it is. Do you think it's impressive to know the theme tunes of popular 1980s TV shows, for example? Do you think it's more embarrassing? Maybe it's impressive when you're that age. Maybe it's more embarrassing for your parents to know it. The car models. So what do you think? Is that difficult or is it easy? Is it more impressive? If you're into cars, maybe more impressive. It's embarrassing. More embarrassing, perhaps. Um, the nice thing about this is it's a blank canvas. You can remove all of this. You can add your own. I'm ashamed to say that I don't have any deep knowledge of Russian culture, for example. I don't know your particular context, so maybe this is a learning experience for me. But are there any particular items, trivial items of knowledge, things that you would know um, relating to your contexts that you would plot on this? Easy to know, more difficult to know, impressive, or more embarrassing? Is there, for example, traditional Russian dance that you might learn? Is it something that you cook? Is there a really naff TV show in Russia, but maybe you know all of the characters' names? By naff, I mean slightly uncool. So this is one to think about. This is one maybe you can take away and think about when you've got more time, more space there. I'm going to get onto an ELT adaptation in just a moment. Okay, let's come through. History of all wins and losses of a football team. And you've had a couple of wins recently in the World Cup. So it's getting better. Is it impressive or is it embarrassing? Maybe knowing all the top scorers for the top teams in Russia over the years. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide now because this is slightly more rather embarrassing. This is slightly more relevant to what we're doing in our day-to-day jobs. And this is where we might be using models more with fellow teachers rather than in a class situation with students. So this was basically I had a blank canvas. This is a Google document, in fact, that I've clipped this picture from, and I had a number of items taken from a coursebook contents page. I suppose their syllabus, or the items of language they're looking to cover in that book. And I asked a handful of people to work together to plot those items on a grid, going from easy or difficult to teach or learn, depending on which way you look at it, and going at the bottom from less useful to more useful. And this is all very subjective. So if you disagree, if you think that holiday vocabulary is much more useful because holidays is much more important in your situation or more important for your students, maybe that's something you might move. And I should say that this is not a kind of definitive research project at all. It was just a quick thing I wanted to do to experiment with this adaptation of this model, to use it with fellow teachers for kind of planning purposes. So if you think about it, you have your coursebook, you have chapter 1. In chapter 1, maybe you'll have the holiday vocabulary. But maybe you think there's something more immediate, more useful to learn beforehand. And this would be a nice way to decide, basically, within a team of teachers. This could be in your institution where you work. What needs to be taught? What will be taught? What I'd like to try to do now is get you to have a go at this yourselves. I've set up some online documents. So again, this could be something you have in the background or you do over the next few days if you have time. And these are on Dropbox paper. I understand from working with some people in Russian before, there's various issues sometimes with Google. So I'm hoping that this one will work. I've set up a few of these matrices. So I don't think you can click them there. So I will quickly put those in the box. And hopefully these come through as quick clickable links. Yes, there we go, lovely. So what I suggest is to divide up the group. So for example, maybe if your names are beginning A to F, go to number 1. If your names begin G to K, go to number 2. L to Q, number 3, R to U, 4, and then the rest of the alphabet, number 5. But of course, if you see that there's many people there, you might want to find another one. These would be a space where you can try and plot items yourselves. Okay, so it's a space for you to work if you'd like to. It should be the case that if you click on those links, if you go via that, you should have editing purposes. And I've seen somebody has gone into number 1 at least. They all come up as G for me for guest. You can click on them now. I might not be checking with them. We might not be feeding back, but you can click on them and you can go in them and you can have a go. And hopefully you can play around. They're basically tables. And you have a number of items, 1 to 10. And the idea is put these numbers, 1 to 10, in the box according to how useful or how difficult you think these items are. So if you are in there and you want to do that, feel free, okay? Just be aware it's online, and if you log in, other people can see what you're typing. But of course, if you don't want to, that's completely fine. I'll leave those up, so if you do want to come back to them later, you can do that. Conversely, you can also set up your own documents and things like that. So it's a way to collaborate quickly. If you're with a group together face to face, you might just do pen and paper to plot different things. It requires registration. Oh. So you can't type on them. Is that the case? Oh, I'm very sorry, Svetlana. I thought it was I could invite people and they just need to do that. I'm very sorry. If that's the same case, is that the case for everybody? The same. Oh, I really apologize. I hope at least you can see the page and it's clear what was meant there. Can you see the page? I kicked and hadn't come back. Oh gosh. I don't want you to fall down an internet rabbit hole. I apologize. What I will do is I will follow up with Elena afterwards, and I will do a kind of a quick summary of different models and put these into a document which I can send to you. I'll also make sure you can get a copy of the slides, and Elena has those. And I'm sure if you're registered for Trendy English, then there's a way to get this information to you to give you an idea of how to use it. I'm so sorry that we're not able to actually work on that right now. Hopefully you'll be able to think about the next model, which I'll look at in a moment, just by yourself. And if you draw, again, it's another matrix. We looked at different matrices here. You'll be able to do that on your own. Again, you can share as well if you feel like it. Sorry, excuse me. This one, apologies. This is the name of the model, so if you have any bad feelings about history concerning US presidents, don't hold that against me. This is a model for organizing yourself, really organizing, so tasks. So what I'd like to ask you to do now is to make a list of tasks you need to do. I'm thinking ELT related tasks. If you'd like to, share them in the chat box. So maybe this could be preparing for the next lesson, or preparing for the next course, or maybe if you are the period of the year where you are planning trips, it might be relating to that. So first of all, make the list, all the things that you've got to do, and then sort of rank them just mentally at the moment and decide how important or how urgent these are. So if you do want to, a few minutes, share those in the chat box. If you don't want to, of course, you can write down on pen and paper or type into your own computer notebook applications, that's fine. I'll just give a moment. If anybody does want to, they can share them there in the chat box. We'll see what we're going to do with these in a moment. I'll start. Okay, so if you look in the chat box, I've quickly typed up 3 things that I've got to do for the summer course that I'm teaching on, which is starting on Monday. So the first thing is I need to get some getting to know you activities together for my first class. One other thing I also need to do, or I can do, is to find out how to use the university library, so I'm able to tell my students or help them if they're having any issues. And the final item there on that list of 3, I have to read a number of articles. My students are going to be writing summaries a bit later in the week, next week, so that I'll be able to actually assess whether they're good summaries or not. So in terms of urgency, well, the first one's probably most urgent because that's Monday. The library one, there's no deadline for that. It's not a particular lesson that I've said I'm going to do that yet, so it's less urgent. They're both still quite important. Probably the first one's more important than the second one. But the third one relates to an assessment. So it is in fact probably the most important overall, but it's not as urgent because they've got to do it on Wednesday. So what I would do now with those, I've sort of mentally calculated how important or how urgent they are, is to plot them on a grid like this. So my urgent, slightly important, I'd say maybe it hovers around here. So that's my number one. Hope everybody can see the yellow. That's my planning, getting to know yous. My library one, it's quite important, but it's not as urgent. So maybe it's about here. And then I've got my assessment related one, which is important, but it's not so urgent. So it's perhaps around here. It's not scientific. This is completely kind of subjective again, whether you put them further left or further up or further down. But they'll equate to kind of 4 areas to help you plan. And if I click onto the next slide and just keep those points in mind, so 1, 2, and 3, and then plot them against these 4 areas. So I'll divide, let's draw a few straightish lines. Now, of course, we're not all in the fortunate position to be able to delegate, because sometimes we're the only teacher. Sometimes we're the most responsible person for that group, so we can't actually delegate to anybody. So if I just scoot back again. So my not so important and not so urgent, I can do that later. So finding out about the library, perhaps I could do that on Tuesday. My urgent, my first lesson is probably maybe higher. So we'll put it into that quadrant here. Do it immediately. So plan my getting to know yous. My reading of articles. So number 3 here. Not as urgent maybe, but still important. So that's something else I've got to do immediately. I'll say immediately over this weekend. So this is something that might be useful to help plan time, to really kind of distinguish between those tasks which are pressing. They've got time deadlines, so then they have to be done the next day, or by a certain time, or whether there's a bit of leeway. So for example, I've also got to I've got to tell my students about assessments for their final week of the first 5 weeks of their course. It's not as urgent, but it's still quite important, so it's here. So I can decide to do that later on, so maybe towards the end of next week, or maybe even the week after that. So it's not something urgent they need to know now. I hope that's clear. If anybody can just type in the chat box, and if you have any questions about using that particular model, please let me know now. Could you use this with your students? Okay, that's good to know, Anna. As I said, these aren't any new things, not revolutionary, so they could well be that you've used them extensively. When I get further down my course, the EAP course that I'm currently teaching, it may well be that my students have lots of different things to do, and they might need to think about things like this. So I may be using this one fairly soon. I'm also planning to use a SWOT analysis for the students to analyze where they are at the beginning in terms of being able to do things like research texts, to cite authors in their writing, to be able to understand lectures and so on, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and we'll review them later on. These are all kind of living models. They're not to be done and dusted. For example, this one, everybody gets new tasks almost every day, really. So it's something that could be done regularly. a habit to get into. Of course, if you use a particular model and you find your students or your colleagues don't get on with it, then perfectly fine to drop. Okay, we're getting into the last few minutes. I think we've got about 20 more minutes. So just a brief comment about what you might need if you want to produce models yourselves for your classes or for your colleagues. And I will go on to the next slide to show a few things. So my particular favorite is this app. Put a big X there, I'll address that in a moment. But my particular favorite is this app, which is it's certainly on iOS, so for iPad, also for the iPhone. I think there is an Android version. If not, there certainly are equivalents. So the term that is useful to look for on your app stores is sketch app, maybe drawing app. There's a plethora of them, loads and loads. And it's about finding which one you're most kind of comfortable with. But I put the big X there because you don't need an app, you don't need a stylus. Really only what you need is on the left hand side here. So paper and pencils or pens. And if you want to share them, well, either you have the physical paper, which you can hand to colleagues, or you can create together with others, or take a picture. We all, well, I wouldn't say all, but many of us nowadays have those devices in our pockets, smartphones, tablet computers, maybe in our bags if we're fortunate to have one. We can quickly snap and we have a record. And that might also be a good thing for students to be able to do, is to record their own models. So if they do the SWOT analysis and they think of their strengths at the beginning of the course, take a photo. Maybe upload that somewhere if you have a virtual learning environment or if you keep a class blog. Of course, bearing in mind not to give away too many personal details for privacy concerns. They can come back to later and they can review. So at the beginning, maybe if they do a SWOT analysis of their speaking, and for example, one of their strengths is that they know a lot of words, but one of their weaknesses might be that they have problems with pronunciation, certain sounds, the opportunities that their speaking skills might give them. So perhaps maybe future travel purposes, or maybe understanding visitors from abroad who may come to their country, may come to their city. Threats. So something threatening. I can't think of anything in that particular situation. Classroom environment for learning is fairly safe, I would hope, but that might evolve. But the thing is that these are, as I said before, living documents. So if you can keep a record of something, then so much the better. That is the end of the content that I wanted to talk through with you today. Just two last things. So here is a slide with a few more models to research. So if you do get a copy of that book yourself, or if you do a bit of searching online for these models, so as well as SWOT analysis, as well as superficial knowledge matrix, the Eisenhower matrix. Here are a few more for various different purposes. So they sometimes have quite odd names. So the top one there, Swiss cheese model. You'll find out what that's about if you Google it. Project management triangle, which again is another one. You may see slightly more ESP, English for specific purposes, or business English orientated perhaps, but I'm sure it could be adapted. And the gift model is another one. These are also ones which I'm researching myself, so I don't know them inside out. Finally, here's a slide of references just to talk about what we looked at today. And there are a few links to blog posts which I've written before, and also a previous webinar, which, as well as this one's recorded. You can go, if you're an IATEFL member, which is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, number 5 on my list there. If you are an IATEFL member, you're able to access that in the member area. So it's, I don't think I covered exactly the same models as in this session with you, but you can, again, listen at your leisure. There are 2 versions of that book. So I mentioned I've got here is an updated version, the one I showed you before, the decision book. The updated version doesn't have all of the same models as the first version. So I can't remember exactly which ones, but you know, there's plenty to search for, to research, and so on.